beautiful synchronization. Who says left unity isn't a thing?
Right.
All right.
Hell yeah. We've got wave sign, or wait, what is it? Not wave sign. What is it? Worm sign from Dune, but we've got waveform.
Yeah. How hyped are you for the new Dune?
I'm extremely hyped. I was actually talking to my roommate because, Texas theaters technically are like open. And I'm like, okay, let's put up the wager of, if Dune was premiering, would you go see it in the theater? And personally, I think I would probably take the risk, honestly.
You would? Yeah.
Yeah, I probably would roll the dice.
I mean, I could see that. I mean, I think there are certain films or certain things where I'm like, yeah, absolutely would risk, potential death.
Including the ultimate form of security, which is unconscious the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. But before we jump into our guest today, whom I'm very excited for, just want to mention that we do have a Patreon. We do accept patrons. You can find us at www.patreon.com/MUHH. And if you enjoyed the show and you feel so inclined, definitely feel free to throw me $1, something like that. I do put all that money back into the podcast production, so it's only going to make things better for everybody. But I'm very excited. Long time coming. We've got today's guest, Adam of Red Library Podcast, maybe I shouldn't disclose your location, but
you're about to dox me right as we start. No,
yeah,
we
exactly.
mentioned it on the show. We're in the same hood. We're in the same city.
All right, cool. So ATX podcasters uniting, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I sought you out, right? I feel like
you slid into my DMs on Twitter and was like, "Hey, what's up? You're in Austin," and then that was the beginning of our weird maniacal friendship. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome, right? But so today we are looking at Slavoj Zizek's book Pandemic, and I forget what the subtitle is. Actually, I should probably bring.
Oh yeah, that's a good question.
Let me see. It's Pandemic. COVID-19 shakes the world.
So this is essentially a 126-page hot take. So I feel like that title is very fitting.
And something that's funny, too, is that I did an episode maybe a couple of months ago, like right before the shelter-in-place kind of shit was going on. And I did a funny episode with a guy Bo from Psychic Dolphin Garage. Because Zizek released a couple of articles to RT that were and he even repurposed some of the content from those articles.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too, because my impression reading through this text, if you can call it a text, or again, it feels like a very long article that you would see on Independent or RT.
Right.
But yeah, I gathered that he had published those articles, and in true Zizek fashion, he writes these off the cuff, fairly short, accessible articles about some major social political event. Everyone gets really pissed off about them for whatever reason because of his hyperbolic nature. And then this is sort of like him elaborating on that and responding to some of the criticisms of the articles themselves, which I actually love that. It's just such a meta commentary of him and his own writing and the people who are critiquing his writing. So it makes for a fun read.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. I'm actually kind of embarrassed because I was totally downplaying the seriousness of COVID at that point.
Oh, really?
But it's a good episode. But yeah, it was like talking about, I'm not shaving my beard. I'm going to be a disease vector, et cetera, et cetera. So then I was like, oh, shit.
I think I remember that episode. I remember laughing whenever you said that.
I feel like quite the asshole in retrospect, considering everything that's happened since. but I don't know. I'm like a naturally skeptical person, especially nowadays. Like it seems things kind of take off on their own into the weird like zeitgeist, and the speed of that and the reach of it. And I don't know, there's something weird about now, like with social media being as intensely utilized as it is, the way that these kind of situations spread, or like things go viral. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think
there's a weird relationship there.
Yeah, no, I think in some ways that, I kind of say this is like a 126-page hot take, a little bit sarcastically and a little bit critically. And also at the same time, this is sort of where I think most people get introduced to Zizek, is this particular kind of writing. He writes these like very like relatively accessible works about some like thing that most people have experience with that you can grasp like really readily. Like this isn't a book about Hegel and Lacan, although Hegel and Lacan are in here obviously, right? But I think the reason why I find Zizek so important to read, especially for things like this, is precisely his focus on the critique of ideology and the way that analyzing the function of ideology specifically in these crisis moments is a really, really important thing to do, because in some ways it is precisely in these moments whenever everyone wants to just like have these knee-jerk reactions that ideology in itself functions most strongly. Because in his definition, ideology is always like the world being presented to you as if like this is just like bare facts, like this is just the nature of reality in itself. And I know we're going to talk about it, but the section about like how do you distinguish data from ideology, I think is exactly kind of why being skeptical is a really important thing to be in these times, to not sort of minimize, but also at the same time not to allow ideology to sort of like function even more effectively, because this is precisely whenever it does that, and like structures of power and elites and like capital itself like really I think accelerates the more that we kind of just accept things as they are, especially in a crisis.
So I kind of want to start us off as far as the nitty-gritty discussion here, and I think this is interesting because I don't know if you've been paying attention to what our good friend Elon Musk, the socialist, has been shitposting over the last couple of days.
I've seen a little bit. I saw there was like a huge thread where he just had a complete meltdown. Someone in our Red Library Discord, big shout out to Metronome21 if they're listening, was like, someone posted that, and then the response was, "Yes, I too have tried mushrooms." And I just thought it was like the best response imaginable for that.
But he said something along the lines of like free America now.
Yeah.
And this was 3 days ago. This is Elon Musk's pin tweet now from 3 days ago. And something that I think is really interesting for me is like, yes, I agree, free America now, but there's a huge difference between what Elon Musk means when he says free America now and what I mean when I say free America now. And I think that you're on the same page with me as far as what free America now really means. You know what I mean?
I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Because I would sort of be curious. I mean, what is your conceptualization of what Elon Musk means when he says free America now?
I have no idea. It's bizarre. It's irresponsible. It's, shock jockery. I don't know. It's like he's a fucking jackass. I mean, what a jackass. Somebody that's got 30+ million followers on Twitter that is some kind of like hailed as like a visionary and entrepreneur, and like this is the like face of the future of capitalism and all of that. And the guy's a fucking moron,
Cooper, are you trying to tell me that you do not think that the best and brightest rise to the top in our capitalist system? Is that what you're really trying to tell me right now?
Possibly, could be leaning in that direction. I don't know. We'll have to see how this conversation goes.
Yeah, that's
right.
right.
I mean, that's like I mean, your example, the discussion of ideology, like this is it with Elon Musk. Also, I think hitting closer to home, so to speak, the fact that Texas has quote unquote reopened as of yesterday, too. Like these are just glaring examples of ideology in the context that you brought up initially.
Yeah, I mean, that discussion of even like a signifier such as freedom, right? And how that gets defined differently depending on sort of
Yes.
the group or like the interest and like the power that someone has in how they define and understand that term. I mean, yeah, again, it's just, say what you will about Zizek, but at the end of the day, I think his project and his focus is one that is absolutely essential. And I think in a lot of ways, it's like not engaging with it, allows even like quote unquote radicals and like revolutionaries that I know of to sort of fall prey to ideological like obfuscation, just as much as any fucking liberal or like reactionary Republican that I know. So, in some ways it's like that critique of ideology has to also be turned like back against yourself, I think, if you want to really be serious about it.
A little self-crit hours. Blah.
Yeah. Who up?
I want to read this quote because this is going to kind of launch me into another kind of bullet point that I want to be sure to hit is it's not hard to imagine that large bands of libertarians bearing arms and suspecting that the quarantine was a state conspiracy would attempt to fight their way out. And so we actually see this, weeks after the publication, maybe a month or so after the publication of the book, we see, particularly like, I think actually were there a similar protest here in Austin, or I can't remember what the context was, but I think there was definitely a May Day protest here, but I think even at the Cap, there might have been like this weird counter protest, but I think Michigan is really the hot spot for this exact phenomenon of these like kooks rolling up to the state house with their fucking AR-15s in tow. And it's such a bizarre, like, ideology is the only way you can explain this. It's such a weird relationship between the sort of Trumper type individual and like how they compartmentalize like the different, like, Trump is somehow not part of the government. It's such a weird, bizarre thing that I think only ideology and psychoanalysis can really help us understand.
I totally agree with that. And I know that you and I both have quite a bit of familiarity with this sort of like more right-wing reactionary kind of mindset. I mean, I think we both like grew up with understanding that intimately, very well. And I think this is precisely why psychoanalysis is so crucial. Like, we actually talk about this more and more on Red Library right now because we do a lot of stuff on Lacanian psychoanalysis, especially lately. But I think the reason why it is also an indispensable tool is because part of what we're trying to understand and part of the political landscape, you have to be able to grapple with these questions of like, how is it possible that this like group who has like resources and like wealth and power and is like relatively, not like comfortable and safe, can also simultaneously feel that they are the ones like most under threat. And that's an ideological sort of process and an ideological like function that you're encountering. And so, yeah, I think you have to be able to find some way to understand that. And I think a lot of the times, whenever you don't have a tool or some sort of framework to understand that, I think it just looks like nonsense, or it's like there's no way you can even understand what the fuck is actually happening in the world around you. Oh shit, sorry, I was gonna say something. Yeah, so I it's funny because thinking about my own background and coming from like a very right-wing, like reactionary sort of place, one of the things that I found really interesting is that there was a study that was done, I think in like the mid to late 80s, on the Marxist idea that essentially the ideas of the ruling class are the dominant ones in society, right? And they basically like tested this. A bunch of sociologists in the UK and in France tested this, and they called it the dominant ideology hypothesis. And they basically did this huge study where they said, okay, well, let's actually just go interview a bunch of people from all different class positions, and let's see what they think about like really core questions about politics and like wealth redistribution, all this other stuff. And what they found was that at the like upper echelons of class society, there was a really, really intense amount of similarity between like ideas. Like, people really did share the same dominant ideology, right? But as you got further down, like into the middle and like working classes and lower classes, it wasn't that they had like people in those class sort of strata like had the same ideas. It was that they had like more of this really like contradictory, like very bizarre, different set of ideas that were almost kind of like welded together, that really were like very contradictory and didn't even make sense. But it's like you can believe a lot of different things at the same time. And whenever I see those people at the Capitol, that's what I think about. It's like, how is it possible that, you know, a billionaire who is in the office that holds, you know, still arguably the most power in the entire world could simultaneously be outside of the system that he in fact benefits from, and is somehow this like great crusader? You know, he's like the God King Trump that's going to save us from like lizard pedophiles. I mean, but that's the thing. It's like, that's how ideology works. It like allows you to cobble together all these different ideas, and somehow it leads to certain actions in the world, right? And that's how you get people showing up at the capitals, because ideology has material effects in the world.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting to look at, because, you know, we're kind of told like the liberal mantra that we're brought up in, or the milieu, is like, okay, you know, there's like there's like a rationality kind of operates effectively. You know, the best ideas are going to win in the marketplace, et cetera, et cetera. But I think you can see very clearly that doesn't happen. And I had a friend that was posting on Facebook. He's like kind of pointing out the same contradiction here between, you know, Trump's involvement in the government and billionaire, et cetera. And like, how is that congruent with this weird, like, fetishization they have with being the victim and playing the victim and feeling like they're under threat, right? And I was like, man, the only way that you can understand this is through psychoanalysis, and there's some kind of like weird, I don't know, identification with the phallus. And I feel like, I don't know, this is my own like armchair psychoanalyst coming out, is like they're never like exiting the Oedipal stage of development, and so they're stuck in that like mommy daddy weird like relationship.
Yeah, I mean, go off, King. That's all I got to say. I mean, it might be armchair psychoanalysis, but it's pretty spot on, right? I mean, because that's exactly why there's this deep libidinal investment in Trump as a figure, as, you know, as the daddy. Is he a zaddy as well? I mean, I think for maybe at least some portion of the right, they absolutely think Trump is the zaddy. I mean, you know, McGowan and Engley did that whole episode on like zaddy fascism recently on Y Theory. And I think it's pretty interesting because they basically say that, in a sense, like what the right and these sort of like more fascistic kinds of worldviews have is like they sort of thrive and they very consciously operate on the figure of the zaddy, right? That there is this figure that's going to give you this deep libidinal investment and like satisfaction. And maybe it's an unconscious satisfaction too, right? That's something that McGowan obviously like talks about. And we're doing a series on his book, Capitalism and Desire, which is all about this. But, you know, I mean, coming from that background, I can absolutely tell you it's like, you know, this feeling of, oh, like we know very well that we're symbolically castrated, and finding a figure to then imagine or like invest in as if they are not, that they're not castrated, is a deeply satisfying and in sort of enjoyable process, right? There's a sort of like perversity of enjoyment in it that I think is like, it can't be underestimated. And that's why, you know, I think a lot of like liberal perspectives of just, oh, if we just like had the right facts, or if people were just more rational, like this wouldn't be happening. And it's like, well, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of like how political power in this way is built in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even to carry that forward into kind of a more a vulgar Deleuzian sort of idea that I have about this too is that, or this is kind of, no, actually this would be like mixing Deleuze and Lacan in this, like Lacan had the super egoic injunction, which is like to enjoy, right? Mm-hmm. And so people that have this like protest talking about, or all these people clamoring to quote unquote open America back up or what have you, right, is like there's a lot of desiring production that's been that's like it's like overflowing. It's kind of like the oil, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's the oil futures trading. Like there's no place to store all of our excess desire, so they're like, turn those desiring machines back on. If you've ever seen, what is it, Trading Places, the Dukes, turn those desiring machines back on.
I mean, this is exactly why, you know, post 9/11, right? Remember that the sort of Bush injunction was basically like, oh, how did we
go
know
out
that
and
things are
shop,
back to
right?
normal? Go out to shop, go out and buy shit. Like in some ways that's also what Bush was saying, right? And there's like there's a resonance here. There's sort of like a similar sort of function that a crisis, whether it's a terrorist attack, at least at the time in the States of unprecedented, proportions, or a fucking global pandemic, like the thing that is most terrifying is the desiring machines being shut down. And so that's why I think the approach has to be like, turn them back on, because in some way, and this is, maybe a more brute, like Marxist point from my own perspective, is that the only way that capital continues to function is that it always has to be in motion. It always has to be circulating. The second that process slows down, that's essentially what leads to crisis. And I think we're seeing that exact thing happening right now. It's like, consumption, circulation, these things are like grinding or sort of like, sludgingly like slowing down. And then it's obviously causing immense havoc and ruptures in the system because, the nature of capitalism has to be constant movement.
But to seriously move on, because I think you had to seriously move on to your legit notes, which are fantastic. Because I think
I was gonna say we could do this all day.
Right? Yeah, for sure. I do kind of want to. There was kind of a point that we'll circle back around to, but I you had some interesting things in the notes about the dialectics of touch, feeling isolated, and sort of bringing out the full presence of the other that were honestly. I'd like to hear you kind of delve into what you're referring to.
Yeah. So for anyone that doesn't have the book in front of them or isn't familiar with it yet, because it's pretty new, Zizek kind of opens with the phrase "No li mi tangere," which is "Touch me not," from John 2017. And what I really love about this is just such of like a true dialectical point. And it's so, I think, characteristic of Zizek's style. But what I really love about it is that, everything contains like the presence of like its opposite. Like that's how it has to be defined, right? It's always this sort of like tension or this like rupture in between two opposite things that is part of, I think, the dialectical method. What it's exploring is always to say, like, how do we understand how two things that seemingly are opposite, like sort of depend on each other? And it's not, the sort of kind of simplistic idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis that I think dialectics really, like a lot of times gets bastardized and thought about, especially by like right-wing assholes like Ben Garrison and shit like that. But, it's like dialectics is really about this idea that there are these two fundamental things that are in like antagonism with each other, and it's and like a synthesis in I think in dialectics, in Hegelian dialectics, is never like there's some resolution. It's that the contradictions persist in new ways. So what I really love about this idea is that it is only whenever we are put into a new material context where we are then forced to be in isolation from each other. Isolation becomes the greatest form of solidarity and like care for others that we have. And I think that this is a really challenging thing for a lot of us because, as someone like I identify as like a communist, right? Or some form of that, whatever the fuck that means anymore. But the idea is that, a lot of times we talk about solidarity all the time. And there's this idea that solidarity is precisely whenever we are sort of like most in proximity to the other. That it is precisely whenever I'm like standing next to you in, like on a picket line, or whenever I'm like giving you food, right? It's this like idea of care that is very much about like direct contact with each other. But what I love about how Zizek flips this is actually to say that in this moment, we're actually understanding that solidarity, to be in solidarity with each other, is precisely to abstain from being in proximity. And I think it's a really dialectical point because it takes something that seems very like logical and sort of we take for granted, and it flips it on its head and sort of like shows that it's actually functioning in like a completely different way at this moment. And I think it's a really interesting thing, to think about. Sometimes like being in solidarity means denying yourself like the very thing that you think you want, precisely to almost like be able to like be fidelitous to some like larger sort of principle that's beyond like your own sort of, basic like needs and sort of wants and desires that you have. And so I think it's a really cool way to start with this because I think it just helps to recontextualize like what we think solidarity is, or how we think being sort of on the left in this particular moment, like what that looks like. Because the people who go to the Capitol, right, like the whole point and the whole like criticism is that like it's them desiring so strongly to have their own individual consumption and their own like ideological definition of freedom, like, which is, oh, I should be able to go get my hair cut. I should be able to like go consume in the way that I normally do. And for you to deny that from me means that like my freedom is being impinged upon. And I think like the opposite conception is what Zizek's offering, which is like, it is precisely by denying yourself those enjoyments that in itself is to be in solidarity and to actually abstain from being in proximity to each other. And so I think it's just like a cool Zizek sort of move where he defines things in the opposite way that you normally would think about them. And then he runs with that idea and like kind of sees where it goes. And it doesn't always go someplace really great or really productive, but it's always fun.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So it kind of moves on to talk about this concept of, I guess, the new normal.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of arising from the ruins, almost like that, the new synthesis to some degree, which is interesting because I think a lot of the desire is to try to sort of go back to normal or normalcy or what have you, but that sort of, that's sort of impossible at this point. And so we have to build this new normal, whatever that is going to look like. And I think some of my own concerns about building that new normal express themselves in this idea that, one, you can't really produce or not produce, but you can't prove a negative. And so there will be a lot of resistance no matter what happens, no matter what the death toll is or et cetera, the fallout in terms of like the illness itself, directly speaking, is that we won't be able to understand or grasp that the measures that have been put in place are effective, right? At sort of, flattening the curve. Like that's the big idea, is to not overwhelm our healthcare system. And so that's what this whole shelter in place is all about ultimately. And I think we're in a very dangerous predicament with this because obviously, I don't want to underscore or like minimize the damage to not only people's health, their lives, their loved ones, their careers, etc. But, let's say this was something like an Ebola, something like a much more, like the death rate was even twice to 3 times what it would be for this illness. And what's going to happen, at some point down the road if a virus like that takes place, like there's going to be a lot of resistance, I think, to applying these same measures. And so one wonders, like, or is sort of horrified at the thought of, these same protesters doing this when there's like an Ebola type situation going on, this weird, like crazy, irrational world that we live in. That's my biggest fear about the new normal, is that this results in this kind of like boy cries wolf scenario where, these people don't, like I said, just because of it's so hard to grasp that the effects, like I said, again, just going back to, you can't prove a negative, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think, wasn't that actually something that Zizek sort of mentions as well, is that, the real trick here, and I know we're going to talk about Agamben, who comes up later in the book, because Agamben, like, who's a very well-known Italian political philosopher, was commenting on the situation in Italy, was to say that, we have to be very wary of this kind of a situation justifying a particular kind of political response and a particular sort of reinforcing of state power and control over, what we could call bare life and biopolitics in the sort of Foucauldian sense. And so, I mean, I think it's really tricky, right? Because this is precisely the question of ideology that we're grappling with. Like, how, in fact, do you distinguish what seems like a quote unquote rational response to the conditions as we can understand them as best as we can versus a ramping up of like an ideological sort of project or an ideological axe that someone has to grind and is going to use a crisis to sort of justify that? Or, like if we respond in a certain way, and then what if it turns out that, oh, maybe this situation wasn't as bad as we thought? I know that there was a study that they did in California where they were testing people for antibodies for coronavirus, right? And they found out that, well, based on the study, and it's only one study and they're going to do more, so keep that in mind. But, they found out that I guess based on the study of the antibodies that people had, that coronavirus was actually likely to be 50 to 80 times more prevalent than they thought. And it had been around a lot longer than they thought. And it was likely that many more people had encountered coronavirus, but like developed antibodies and like didn't actually get sick. And so, it's like, as far as I know, it wasn't, that study wasn't funded by the fucking Cato Institute or anything. I'm sure it's a pretty legit study. And I could see how very easily you could read that study in an ideological way and say, well, yes, like this isn't really that bad. Really, we shouldn't shut down the economy. We shouldn't isolate. But yeah, then what happens, for the next virus? Because with, the climate apocalypse, ever quickening upon us, odds are like there's going to be even more diseases and viruses, and that's going to be a really serious effect of climate change as well. And so, it's like we need to expect that this is, maybe like there could be things much more serious and much more even life-threatening and deadly coming down the road. I think that just... that isn't me being a, major black pill doomer, although I am, but, it's like, but that's, I think, a pretty serious and rational concern to have.
Yeah. Just based on the way that ideology functions, that's the scariest things, like the irrational shit that you can't control. And I hate to skip too far ahead, but I don't know, that image that Zizek gives us of like how funny it is that something like as dumb as like an asteroid or a virus could wipe us out, like, and just sort of underscores our irrelevance or sort of our powerlessness against, whatever nature or time, or I don't even know how to qualify what that would be, can sort of snuff us out. And like the idea of a virus, right? It's a piece of RNA or like DNA and a protein coating, and it's not even really alive technically. It's just this sort of dumb thing. It's a you know what I mean? We have this, I think, idea, in our heads that intelligence is like vital to survival, or it's somehow good for there to be intelligence or whatnot. But like this almost is saying, it's not necessarily the case. It's like kind of putting a check on that idea and saying, whoa, like, it's just things can be dumb and successful, right?
Yeah. In some ways, this is one of the things I get a perverse enjoyment out of reading Zizek still in this way, because I think on some level, even if it's slightly ironic, the basic ontological view is that we live in a monstrous, dumb universe.
Yeah, right.
Really like doesn't adhere, like doesn't bend to the sort of like rational ideas of how we think it should function.
Exactly.
And I think what's like really interesting to bring this up too is how, a reminder that something as like stupid and like you can't even like define it as being alive or dead, like a virus, right? Or like an asteroid, and how this can snuff out everything in an instant. And it actually reminds me of how, after World War I, that the impact on the sort of underlying ideological structure of Western Europe in particular was that, history is progress. Everything about philosophy and art is designed to like increase our progress of civilization, and we're able to understand the world rationally and make sense of it and conquer nature. World War I happens, and essentially it just, in one fell swoop over a couple of years, just systematically destroys every basic philosophical assumption that the entire edifice of like most like Western European and the United States, like our whole sort of worldview was built on. That's where like things like Dada came from, right? Dada was this artistic movement that basically was trying to grapple with the fact that everything that seemed to be rational about the world inevitably brought about the most horrible destruction that no one even could imagine at the time, of like technology and, weaponry and like large armies and total warfare. And I think there's something about this virus that actually reminds me of that. Like it reminds us of like the absurdity of things and like how fragile things are. And I think depending on how you react to that, that could spur you to want to sort of find some sort of liberatory framework in response to that, precisely because, and this is the dialectical piece, right? The more fragile things become, in a sense, like the more imperative it is to find some sort of like liberatory kind of framework that could then counteract that, or could like try to like protect people as much as possible, or like to provide something that could like allow life to be livable in that sort of scenario. But to me, I mean, I think, you know, if we look back, I mean, will we then be able to say that this was the defining ideological like rupture point of our generation? You know, maybe more than 9/11, maybe more than, you know, the economic recession in 2008 and 2009. I mean, we'll only understand it in hindsight. But I do think that ideologically, like, there's something about like this kind of a scenario presenting us with sort of like the absurdity of like the universe that is like, I actually find really hopeful, which is like a really weird, bizarre thing to say. But in some ways it's, you know, it's like that. I mean, how long can things continue the way that they exist in like neoliberal capitalism without something that has to like fundamentally shake you to your core?
Right. Yeah, I always thought, I had predicted for a long time that Mother Nature would be at the vanguard of the revolution. I didn't expect it. I didn't expect it to exactly play out in this fashion. I thought climate change would be that mechanism. But I don't know. There's potential. I think that maybe the best case scenario I see playing out is that the realization comes to fore that there must be some sort of universal basic income offered, and that's like going to be the ruling class sort of way to solve this. Or like, I don't see how you can sort of avoid that moving forward, but I don't know like how bad is the pain going to be until something like that is implemented. Obviously that's just a stopgap to reify the existing system as well, right? But I think that's a possibility in a way that even like, you know, 6 months we might not have even if you are like an optimistic universal basic income, like a Yang Gang or something like that, I don't think you were
Gang.
You were seriously thinking that that's something that could be implemented anytime soon, as crazy and like as reactionary and fucking, I don't even know how to describe the capitalist regime that we're under. But like, that's something that I thought was sort of laughable, and I'm not confident that it's going to lead to anything necessarily better, but I think that UBI is something that really like legitimately could come out of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think so too. I guess that, I mean, there are two things that I think about with the UBI issue at the moment. We were just talking about this actually last night with me and some of the crew from Red Library, that, you know, in some ways, like the whole debate over UBI, I think, was this question of, well, who's the one who's proposing UBI, right? Is it like the, you know, the kind of like upper middle class DSA crowd who wants like fully automated luxury communism? Like, their idea of what a UBI is very different than what Zuckerberg or Elon Musk think about with the UBI, right? Like, the UBI is like a sort of last ditch effort to prevent like capitalism from completely breaking down. It isn't designed to give you luxury. It's designed to give you like bare subsistence, usually, so capitalism doesn't grind to a halt. And, you know, it's funny to think about, even last year, whenever I thought about Yang and the sort of like the, what was it, the freedom dividend? Is that what he called it?
Yeah, the freedom dividend.
Yes. Yeah. So with the idea of the freedom dividend, you know, it always struck me that it was kind of like the idea, like the second wave radical feminist idea of wages for housework. It was this really like relatively radical idea that was never designed to be like an actual like concrete policy recommendation. It was always this thing of like, we're going to suggest this to sort of extend the horizon of what we want. And I think in some ways, like, UBI has now very realistically become like a thing of concrete practical importance just to prevent capitalism from breaking down. And I think that all these like debates about like UBI and what is its function and like who's introducing it and like what's going to be the effect materially on how capitalism functions, like these things are like hot issues now. And it's not just like a bunch of academic debates happening in like, you know, the Jacobin like Catalyst Journal, because I mean I've read those, you know, and they're interesting. And now all of a sudden it's like those debates are like of utmost practical importance for, you know, not just like, you know, people who read shit like that, but, you know, for like my family back home, and, you know, like for me and for you, right? These are like questions of material practical importance that are going to be decided and very likely are going to have to be implemented in some way. And that is a, you know, it's a thing that Lenin said, right? How like sometimes, you know, there are years where like nothing happens, and then there are weeks whenever years happen. And I think we're definitely in one of those moments right now where it's like really astonishing to witness it, and also to, not necessarily feel like you're like actively participating in history. You're just kind of watching it happen. And I think that's a tough experience, to say the least.
We're strapped into the roller coaster, essentially.
Yeah.
All of us. And we're going down. We're not sure what's going to happen. We're going into a tunnel right now. We're not clear on what the next hurdle or thing's going to be. But I guess moving on with the piece, so Zizek gets into a little bit about the Communist Party in China and discussing crackdowns on student movements, but most importantly, this challenge of the old Maoist slogan of trust the people, which I'm not as familiar with. I'll maybe leave you to comment on that. I'm not as read up on Mao, to be honest.
Well, I'll do my best to give some idea of how I read
some
this.
Context here.
Yeah. So I think that in sort of the last phase of Mao's life in China, there's essentially this shift to saying that the main class struggle right now is no longer between, let's say, like a nascent like communist movement and like a nascent like proletarian and agrarian sort of revolutionary movement against like the forces of capital and imperialism. But it shifts to more of the idea that the class struggle now shifts from a material struggle to one of ideological struggle. And the way that it was conceptualized was about the people with the capital P versus like the state party bureaucratic apparatus. And as that became more solidified and more sclerotic and everything else. And so I think like Mao's whole sort of perspective, and this is really what a lot of the genesis of things like the 100 Flowers campaign and, even like the very early beginnings of the Cultural Revolution were designed to say that the party state apparatus has become bureaucratic. It has sort of led to this new kind of solidified class interest that is actually against the very people it claims to represent. And so I think the idea of like trust the people, this Maoist slogan is, I think at least on the surface, and we can maybe talk about how much we want to really like give credence to Mao, like really being truly a representative of the people, or whether this was him actually wanting to reclaim power in his own state party bureaucratic apparatus. I'm very interested in like this history, and I think it's still to me like not super clear on like what was actually happening.
Yeah.
But I think the idea would be that like trusting the people is kind of this Maoist slogan of saying that the state party bureaucratic apparatus like no longer trusts the people because it now is fundamentally operating on a different set of interests. And this is actually a question of the ideological struggle is precisely one where the people are looked at as being, like untrustworthy, or they need to be controlled. They need to be guided by the party. And so to me, that's kind of the way that I read it, is that it's this sort of command or this sort of injunction to say, the people together in their collective interests have like a sort of wisdom or a direction, and we need to like trust that. So I don't know. What do you make of that? Does that kind of make sense for you?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I'm curious, you might know this better than I. Is this kind of around the period where Mao was like telling the students to like kill party members or like bomb the party office, something like that, bomb party headquarters, or do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I mean, like the early phases of the Cultural Revolution are like so complicated, and I think that the way that you interpret these and sort of like think about this history, I think does actually have pretty serious implications for your like political analysis of like the relationship between like the state or like a party, right? And like the people, the collective interests that they're, sort of either operating against or supposed to be operating in the sort of, in their place, right? Or they're supposed to be the voice of the people, let's say. So my understanding of this history from, the best historians of it, not just like, shitty like Red Guard's takes on it, but like the actual historians of it, is that, in a sense, this is the result of like Mao trying to reclaim power back within his own party that he had been sort of divorced from and was increasingly being marginalized from. And sort of in some ways, like he was this very charismatic, like very, like world historical figure. And I think he carried a lot of weight because of that. And his sort of, encouraging of students and of youth to sort of, in a way, like rise up against what he saw as a sort of like re-emerging interests of like a sort of like a proto-capitalist class, like a state capitalist class, was to say, well, like, your parents, like these older generations, they were revolutionaries, but now they're sort of being like sort of seduced back by capital, and was to say like they need to basically, you need to like rise up against them. So the idea is that maybe this was actually more driven by Mao wanting to use like the people as like a new, like a base for him to reclaim power within the party. But to me, it seems pretty clear that what he did not count on was the fact that if you get a bunch of high schoolers to just be full of like revolutionary zeal and then just like set them loose, and like kind of give them like in some ways like symbolic authority to do whatever they want to do based on that ideological vision. I mean, it had pretty fucking disastrous consequences. And yeah, like, like communities were destroyed, but like people were being tortured. Like, I mean, this shit happened, Yeah. I mean, I think that's like pretty clear in the history. But what's really wild is that eventually those Red Guards groups splinter off into their own, like almost like gangs. And then those Red Guard groups start like actually waging war against each other. And then the army eventually had to be called in by Mao to put them down because they completely lost their shit. And I mean, but it's a fascinating history to me because it really does speak to, I think, like this question of like the relationship between the people and the state. Right. And sort of, and in this very unique context, I think of like how that actually played out. And so, just to bring it back to the text, I mean, I think that, it's interesting for Zizek to sort of invoke trust the people, because Zizek is also someone who is incredibly skeptical of the people, in a lot of ways. And I find that really interesting about him because he seems to like always advocate this sort of like, he doesn't have any utopian, like rosy, vision of like some like unified humanity that like wouldn't be rife with like contradictions and tension and conflict. I mean, I think even though he advocates for that in this piece, I think he also inherently like doesn't trust the people. Like he's a deeply paranoiac person. And so I just find it a really interesting thing for him to say that because like to some degree, I agree with him, right? Like we can't assume that like people as groups, like, are like 100% fully rational, right? And yet at the same time, like there has to be a certain way of at least in Zizek's perspective to be able to grant them more trust precisely to take it away from the state. And I think that's what is like an interesting and kind of a, maybe a dicey sort of theoretical move to make, but it's one I find actually pretty interesting to explore.
Yeah, I think that relationship between, I guess, revolutionary movements and the state, obviously someone who kind of tends to identify as an anarchist communist of some stripe, right? Like
yeah,
I think that's an interesting relationship, and I don't know as much about sort of the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, to speak too much to it. But I've heard that something like along the lines, if you're an anarchist is just like a Maoist is a disciplined anarchist or something like. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you heard this?
Yeah, I have actually. I mean, I've read a good bit of. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, and that's why, like, to some degree, I don't put a lot of stock in like hard distinctions between like different positions on the left, because I think in a lot of ways, like to me, it usually just becomes a ideological justification to just like be an asshole to other people.
Right.
I mean, there are like real theoretical and historical like points of contention to like debate, right? I mean, I think that's true, but more often than not, I mean, the fact is that Mao himself was very influenced by anarchism. There's a great book I'm looking on my shelf right now. It's called Critical Perspectives on Mao Zedong Thought. And it's really great because there is a lot of discussion in there about the sort of the anarchist influence in the early development of Mao's particular interpretation of Marxism. And like, to me, it sort of complicates the picture, right? It's like, there really maybe is a lot more overlap, or there's historical relationships between something like Maoist thought and anarchist thought than maybe most people realize.
Right.
So, I think that saying absolutely makes sense to me. And as someone who's identified as both an anarchist and a hardcore Maoist at different points, I mean, I feel like I have very intimate knowledge of like, oh yeah, there's actually a lot of similarity between these two.
I think to give that a lot more material credence in the context of where we are now, I think this is interesting in this context of like this tension between federal and state power, and how that's going to work with this idea of states reopening, the economy, or reopening, however you want to contextualize that or use that idea. I think that's a really interesting dynamic because, right, like I could see, of course, our illustrious Governor Greg Abbott is all for like reopening the country, but I don't think that's going to, like, I think the city of Austin in particular would be very resistant to reopening to some degree as much as they kind of can. So I'm interested in that sort of, that tension. That's one side of it, right?
Yeah, I was curious. I mean, do you see that, especially in a city like Austin, which is, I mean, I guess I would still call it very liberal overall as a city.
Right.
I'm wondering, do you see that there's going to be like tensions and sort of like conflicts and contradictions between, the order to reopen the economy, but maybe a lot of, this is like where that like reactionary like glorification of small businesses like bites like the power like the sort of power structures that be in their ass, because it's like, oh, like, yeah, it's all about small businesses and entrepreneurship. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, let's reopen the economy. And then all the small businesses are like, fuck you, we aren't reopening. Like, we're not doing any of that. Like, I could see some of that stuff playing out. I'm curious what you kind of predict might happen with like the tension between like local businesses and like the larger state order. Yeah,
it's interesting because I'm the kind of situation that I recall bringing up this tension in the past was it was several years ago whenever Uber and Lyft, I think, the city of Austin had passed this ordinance where you were going to have to be fingerprinted to be a driver.
I remember this.
For Uber and Lyft, and I was driving for Uber and Lyft on the side at the time. And so I think the state ended up somehow circumventing that requirement, or they kind of like basically overruled this city ordinance. So that kind of technically, I guess, went away as a requirement for the city. And so I feel like this is another example of, someone like Greg Abbott who claims to be about, freedom and all that kind of bullshit, but is ready to use like state power to override local government, clearly exposing how much of a fucking the hypocrisy of his whole like freedom, pulpit that he's trying to preach from, right? So I don't know. Yeah. I'm curious to see like what is people have been talking to Trump about, reopen the economy. What the fuck's he going to do? Send in the National Guard to, force restaurants to open up and force people at gunpoint to go into a restaurant? It's such a, like, the contradictions in that whole move themselves are dizzying as fuck, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's really sort of bizarre to think about. I actually just had this image of, like Trump's, like the militias, like the right-wing militias operating on behalf of Trump, like coming to kick your door down and to like drag you to Applebee's just so you'll consume.
Exactly.
I mean, it's interesting because this is something that, I think with the Uber and Lyft and that ordinance that was passed in Austin, but the other thing that I think about is whenever we passed paid sick leave in Austin as well, and that was seen as this huge victory for a sort of like burgeoning leftist, like, it was like very DSA sort of led, but that was seen as this huge victory. And at that particular moment, I think, the Bernie Sanders campaign was ramping up. And so it was seen as like, oh yes, this is a sign that like we're, our time in power is nigh, right? Like it's coming. And then they win this victory in the city of Austin. It gets kicked up to the state, and then the state just demolishes it. Yeah, and then, and it really sucked a lot of the air, I think, out of like groups like the DSA. And we have, I think, still one of the largest DSA chapters in the country. And I think that this is something that Frederick Jameson talks about. So I'm gonna invoke my zaddy, Frederick Jameson. But Jameson writes a lot about how in the sort of like context of American politics and sort of the history of like the development of the state and like federalism and shit, that this tension is actually like really, really acute in the United States more than anything, not just because of our history of political institutions, but also because of the ideology that we have, right? And this thing about Abbott is exactly the point. It's like, yeah, we'll talk about like freedom and my freedoms and like, Team America and all this other bullshit until it comes down to something that is very materially about, like we have to keep the economy moving. And then it's like the sort of facade like falls. And then you see that, oh, at the end of the day, it's about state power.
Yeah.
Like it is about power. And it's about these people have control over the institutions and levers of power. I mean, this is something that like Perry Anderson talks about too. It's like, whenever you read like right-wing philosophers and like political theorists, it's always important to remember, it's like, these are the people who have power at the end of the day, and, say what I will about me being a communist. I mean, at the end of the day, like these state power institutions, like these state apparatuses, right? It's like, by and large, the political conditions that we're in, like greatly favor people more like Abbott having control over these institutions than people like me or you.
Right. I think interesting as part of like continuing this out further, like this line of argumentation is that you have the tensions between, I can't remember which state it was, but there's like these supplies of, I forget if it was masks or what the situation was, but like the state called in the National Guard to protect these supplies from, I think, if I'm remember correctly, it was like civilian federal government officials or something like that, right? Which was kind of an interesting thing to see. You don't see a lot of that kind of like state versus federal government tension like in our era, right? Like in civil rights or something like that, that tension is like much more apparent. But like today, it's interesting to see that. And so I think that's an outgrowth of this same kind of weird relationship that's happening, and maybe, the tremors of some sort of balkanization process.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying that you're really all for Texas independence? Is that what you're really in favor of?
I'm for Texas becoming the new Slovenia, and then I personally will produce much of the region's theory for the next several decades.
I like it. I'd be in favor of that. I mean, if the Balkanization of the United States as a collective, like political entity, were to basically just lead to more regionalized philosophical and theoretical specialists, I'm on board for that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's maybe the greatest thing. This is a really terrible thing I'm about to say. That's almost like the best thing that came out of like the breakup of Yugoslavia, of like the SFRY, was at least, we had this very regionalized, specific Slovenian school of psychoanalytic theory. So that's really the only good. I mean, it's a great thing. There's a lot of horrible shit that came out of the Yugoslavia breaking up, but we got that.
Yeah, that's the dialectical movement, was to produce Zizek himself. He completed the system of Slovenian idealism.
and we all either benefit or are cursed by it, depending on who you asked.
Exactly, but it's funny too, the parallel between Slovenia and or wait, is it Slovakia or Slovenia? I get those confused.
Slovenia.
Okay, so
yeah,
I believe they share coastline. I can't remember what body of water, but they're both on the coast. So that's my like logical analogy for Texas.
Texas is just Slovenia in the United States. I like it. At the risk of trying to make some connection here, in some ways, whenever we talk about like this tension between like state and federal power, this isn't like all that different in some ways from the exact thing that we criticize places like the Soviet Union and communist China about, because the whole argument, especially whenever people talk about things like the Great Leap Forward or like the famines in like socialist countries, right? Like the whole criticism is always that even like, well, let me say this, the most sort of at least sophisticated criticism is usually that it had to do with this tension between like a state party like apparatus up top, but then the regional representatives of that party, and then basically them having to basically like cook the books on like production numbers, on like yields of harvest, to essentially like meet these targets that were set by the by the sort of party apparatus. And to some degree, it's like, I know it's a completely different context, but it's so funny, like whenever we critique like how, like to some degree, like let's say in communist China, right, like we'll critique that historically and say, oh yes, well that's a sign of like this authoritarianism and state power, and we should be in like, basically dismiss all of it or like ruthlessly reject it because of that. But yet in the United States, it's like, there might be tension there, but really at the end of the day, whenever push comes to shove, like the whole way our government is set up is to basically like still grant priority to federal power whenever it needs to implement it. And so, in some ways, like this whole order thing is kind of a funny like ironic twist of history, that maybe at the end of the day, what we're going to see is how much like federal power really is going to like win the day. Whenever really push comes to shove, it's going to be like that federal power that dictates how things are going to go, or at least it's going to attempt to.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that does play out, and depending on how, I'm not as pessimistic as I was at the beginning of this, I guess, but it'll be interesting.
Of the podcast, or
oh no, just like I guess more so in terms of the beginning of sort of the real like shelter in place scenario to now.
Yeah.
I mean, I was pretty concerned at the beginning just because I think that there's, when I see these videos of farmers plowing their crops under, et cetera, it's like, well, fuck, we are going to be fucked we're going to starve because, for one thing, this entire food production apparatus is so welded to production for profit that whenever you remove profit, the whole fucking system is going to collapse and we're going to starve. And so that was like something that was big on my mind. It's more like this idea that, okay, well, capitalism is shaky right now. It could, something new could emerge, but in the meantime, we're probably there's the potential to, like, our entire way of life is going to be disrupted, and like a sinking tide sort of sinks all boats kind of thing, more so than like this optimistic thing that, okay, this is going to lead to some sort of, real reckoning of the system, which Zizek is sort of trying to argue for. I'm not as sanguine about that. So.
No, I mean, I think it's a good thing to bring up. I actually talk about this with, other people on the left, especially, self-proclaimed revolutionaries and radicals like myself, is that, this glorification of like revolution with this idea that it will like fundamentally change everything about our basic coordinates of like political and economic and social life. Whenever you historically look at, well, what usually leads to a revolution, it's usually major social crisis. And the thing is that, in some ways, it's like if you ever advocate for that sort of thing, it should be done with a very, very severe amount of like gravity and sort of like resignation. Yeah. Because odds are, if something ever has to come to that point, like it is going to be like destructive on a level that is hard to contemplate. And I think that, it's one of the jokes I always saw like in memes about like Bernie Sanders, right? Where it would say that, oh, like Bernie is the compromise. Yeah. And I think that there was something that I always really appreciated about that, because it's basically saying that, listen, like an actual like revolution is a horribly violent, destructive thing. This is what Trotsky said, actually, about anarchists. So I mean, say what you will about like this quote, but it's like, what did these people like think that a revolution is like some peaceful process? It's like, it's a revolution. Like that's the nature of it, is to be violent, and I think he was saying this more about like pacifists and stuff, right? Because I know, that's maybe a bit of an unfair sort of like reading of Trotsky's quote, but I do think that that's something that has to be grappled with like very seriously, that it's like to see systemic change on the level that we want to see is usually going to necessitate some very, very severe crisis that's going to bring it about. And that's not anything, I know for me, even describing myself as, like a radical revolutionary or whatever, that's not something that I'm enthusiastic about, or want to see that happen almost in this like pure, just like death drive sort of like desire, it's like, it's going to be horrible, and that's something I think has to be taken really, really seriously, especially if you're advocating some sort of like revolutionary change and like overthrow of capitalism.
Yeah. It's funny too, like along those same lines for me, cause I'm somewhat into like certain strains of accelerationism too, and it's like I've had this idea that like I said earlier, that Mother Nature would be at the vanguard of the next revolution, not anticipating something like COVID being the vector for that, and realizing that like, whoa, shit, like sometimes I don't want to be right, because like that shit is like it's scary. Like whenever the wheels of history are turning, like that's some scary shit to be. It's like you're in the dryer, you know what I mean? You're sort of like tumbling around, and like, or that metaphor of the fucking the roller coaster. It's like, we're strapped in now. Like you're gonna have to ride this thing out and come out on the other side, and we'll see what the hell happens, and we'll do our best to come out, and hopefully, fingers crossed, in a better world. But
on Red Library, we're like the way that we kind of describe our perspective on a lot of things is what we call like dialectical pessimism. And, you know, that's something that we're kind of like working through with some other shows on a podcasting network that we're on called the Lost Horizons Network, that we started with a couple of other shows, The Regrettable Century and From 78. So Neil, who's been on, you know, Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour, is from the From 78 podcast. So, but, you know, we talk about this. It's like, you know, a lot of times I think we don't understand that, like, in that sort of process, like being in the dryer, being on the roller coaster, it's like, you know, if you're going to be in that sort of historical moment, there is no guarantee. There's actually probably very little possibility that you're going to be the sort of like the great, like, incendiary figure, like leading the masses. It's like odds are it's like you're going to basically be just fucking cannon fodder,
right?
You know, in these sort of like great historical processes of like and you're just going to be ground up in the wheels, you know, like the way that untold countless millions upon millions and millions of people have always been.
Yeah.
You know, and that's like the thing that's also, I think, like has to be grappled with like very seriously, is that, you know, even like wanting that sort of a process to initiate or like to want that to happen also means that to some degree you have to accept the fact that you may play no part in it, or you may just be, you know, like ground up, like, you know, you're going to be the manure of history as we talk about on our show sometimes.
Right. It might be as if to reference back to the Zizek piece or book rather, the War of the Worlds scenario where the invading aliens in H.G. Wells' classic encounter our germs and they can't withstand them, and our dumb germs end up defeating this highly technologically advanced species or what have you, and Zizek very characteristically, as you mentioned earlier, flipping that relationship on its head, I think is some interesting ground there. But I'm curious to get what your take is on this kind of metaphor that sees us as the Martians.
I mean, this is the risk of putting Zizek's joke back on himself. This is pure ideology, because, you know, in some ways it's like the Mr. Smith philosophy or Agent Smith philosophy from The Matrix, right? Is like, oh, like we are the virus, you know, and to some degree I'm like a little skeptical of this, because it's the same thing where people are like saying, oh, like, you know, now that shelter in place orders are happening all over the world, the earth is healing now.
Right, yeah.
And like one of my favorite things, I saw someone post, it was like a picture of like the old Lisa Frank like coloring books where it was like really bright neon colors, and it says, look, the earth is healing, we are the virus. And that's been one of my favorite things that I've seen in all of this. But I mean, I guess I do, like, it's interesting, right? Because it basically flips the idea, even if you don't go so extreme as to say like, oh, we are the virus, but I think to like flip it on its head and not see us as the protagonist, right? The inherently sort of benevolent protagonist, like, is, I think, actually a really productive thing to do ideologically as well. Because Zizek's whole thing, right, is this idea that like the universe is this like monstrous, stupid thing that we're a part of. And I think it's sort of a way of like dethroning like human subjectivity or like humanity as being this sort of like driving, like rational, progressive force in the universe. And I think that's actually a really important thing to do, because, you know, to some degree, part of the sort of like liberal ideology is still based on this idea, you know, that progress is something that's inevitable and is going to happen, and that humanity is its vehicle. And even, you know, people who are like green capitalists and shit like that, like they're still operating on this idea that humanity is this like benevolent subject. You know, it's like, oh, we might need to minimize the effects, the sort of externalities of the systems that we're creating and perpetuating, but really at the end of the day, we're the good guys. And I do think to some degree, even if you don't go as far as saying we're like a cancer and a plague upon the earth, I do think we need to dethrone us as inherently the good guys, for sure.
Agreed. Hard agree.
Yeah, I was wondering what you make of that.
But also Zizek gets into Han's kind of discussion of the burnout society and the process of self-subjugation that I think really makes itself known in a different context within this, whenever everyone is working at home, and sort of this idea that, you know, you can't waste all this quote-unquote extra time that you've been given. And I don't know, that sort of like push to improve, like gain a new skill, you know, that to land a better job or something, which is really bizarre. But I don't know, you might be able to speak to Han's point a little. I'm not as acquainted with their work.
I was actually curious before, we talk about like Han's theory specifically. I know that you've been feeling the pressure from this a little bit. I know we talked about this with like, oh, we have all this time at home. So like, yeah, you should be productive, like gain a new skill, but like work out and like do all this other stuff. It's like, don't waste this opportunity that you have. Right. It's like seeing these conditions, which are very, very Foucauldian in nature as like, oh, it's something that you should engage in, like what Foucault would call like the sort of like technologies of the self. It's like, oh, this is precisely whenever you need to like discipline yourself or like construct yourself in a new way to make you like more like a more full subject in a certain way.
Yeah, definitely. By like, keeping, all the advice is, oh, keep a routine, like still get shower and dressed for work and like have that routine and, like I said, pick up a new hobby or skill or what have you, which ironically I've actually been doing. It's been great for my like theory reading stack. That's actually, I'm getting theory, lots of theories been read, which is good because I had been slack. Like it's been a good impetus to like finally have the time to get to that rather than being like so burnt out that I don't even have the energy to do that. But yeah, I mean, I guess I am in that panopticon with working out, gaining new skill sets, reading, like gaining new knowledge. I'm ready for the post-COVID economy. It's going to be like,
hell yeah, you're going to be such a badass subject by the time this is done.
I am totally putting body without organs on my resume.
It'll be on your business
I'm fully
card. Like nomadic.
Yeah. Nomadic war machine.
That should. No, I mean it's like it's a really insidious sort of process, I think. I'm doing the same thing, right? I mean it's interesting for me because I'm still working through all of this.
Same.
And for anyone who right. And so like for anyone who doesn't listen to our show already, we talk a lot about social work on the show. So I'm a clinical social worker, which basically is a fancy way to say like I'm a therapist like with a social work background. But it's like I work primarily with the most vulnerable people and the people who are really, I mean, the boot is on their fucking neck in all of this. Like, and it's like way more intense than it normally is, and it's normally intense. And I hit burnout myself like hard, this week. And it's been interesting because part of me was like, oh, like whenever all this started, I was like, well, I'm going to be working from home a lot more. I'll have time to like get caught up on my theory reading and like, doing workouts and stuff, and that was sustainable for a little bit. And then all of a sudden it's like the intensity of the work and like doing this kind of like care emotional labor, like really hit me hard. And I found that even though I have all the time, I'm actually reading less than I normally do because I'm just like so fucking burnt out. And I think like talking about Byung-Chul Han's Burnout Society is really important here because, the idea is that in all of this, I think for Han, his idea is that class struggle, the way that we typically historically define it, is like no longer the situation that we find ourselves in, at least in like Western Europe and in the United States. That in a sense, like antagonism is no longer directed at like an alternative class or like an antagonistic class towards you, but it's something that we fully internalize and are now in this antagonistic relationship with ourselves. And so the reason why we feel, oh, I gotta make use of this time, I have to be productive, is precisely because on some level, it's like you have internalized your boss. Like you are your own boss now. And this is like in some ways kind of what Foucault says in the introduction to, I think it's either 1,000 Plateaus or Anti-Oedipus. I think it's 1,000 Plateaus. Oh yeah, it is Anti-Oedipus. So where he talks about we got to kill the fascist in our heads. But this is like the idea, right? Is like the sort of technologies of the self, or like how we basically now have internalized within our own ability to be subjects the exact functionings of power that are required for capitalism and for political institutions to continue functioning the way that they do. And it's really insidious because how do you fight something that you've internalized? It's like the only way you do it is like to sort of turn this kind of like antagonistic, like sort of like death drive, like directly onto yourself. And, there are some people that think that, this is part of why things like depression and anxiety diagnoses are like skyrocketing in terms of their prevalence and their rates, because it's an effect of where this sort of antagonistic struggle is now like deeply internalized. And it's like part of the effect of that is this sort of what are called like psychic injuries that we're now dealing with on a really, really rampant scale, or at least they're being diagnosed more, because on some level it's like an effect of this shift to say that, you know, now the struggle is inherent like within you as a subject.
Yeah.
And this is really bringing all that out, because now everyone's working from home and you have to be, you know, it's like now you're solely responsible for disciplining yourself to make sure you work and shower. I mean, you know, maybe the biggest act of resistance you can do in these conditions is to go full Diogenes and like, you know, live in a barrel and like don't bathe and like shit on the floor and jerk off all the time. I mean, maybe that's the real act of resistance right now. So.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
Externalize your internal struggle.
Exactly.
Reverse the process.
Hell yeah, that should be the battle cry, actually. Externalize your internal struggle. That's really good.
Hell yeah. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add there before we, because I think this is something you could speak to. You know, you spoke to this a little bit, but about the sort of three types of workers and fatigue and how that impacts different types of workers, because you have someone like yourself, and Zizek exemplifies like someone who's providing care. Not only are you having to do a job, like not only is there a task that you must complete, but you must be emotionally invested in that task and the process and the outcomes. That is different. Like, yes, I mean, I don't want to underscore the sacrifice of those folks that are like working at grocery stores and whatnot, right? Because they're putting themselves, it's a life and death situation that they're in, right? But they're well, I guess they're part of this too, because there is that, I mean, I think the realization of your own, I mean, God, it's just the contradictions of capital just become so immensely crystallized in that situation where you're someone that either in your position or someone that is like getting up and going to work at a grocery store every day, like the psychic weight of like knowing that you going to work could lead to your death, and there's no, you know what I mean? That's such a fucked up situation to be in, and sort of having the gun to your head and not having a choice, you know, not having the ability of someone like myself who's in a position to work from home in relative comfort and out of the face of danger. But
yeah, I mean, it is. I think you're exactly right. It's like the sort of like revealing. I've been talking about this situation as like truly apocalyptic lately, and apocalyptic in the actual sense of what that word means, which means like to reveal something, because that's what it's doing. It's revealing the sort of really intensifying, like deepening contradictions of capital. You know, I mean, to me, it's like I do get to work from home to some degree, but not entirely, you know, and it's a really weird thing, because like Han has this like distinction between like three different types of worker. And I think his like point is to say that, at least Zizek's point is to say that, well, at least with some types of work, like maybe care work or like emotional labor, whatever it is, you might be exhausted and burnt out. And at least there's this feeling of you've actually helped somebody. Right. Like you've actually done something that's valuable and is actually like, it's not a bullshit job, as like David Graeber would say. But I actually think like to some degree, like these three distinctions like break down pretty heavily, because I can tell you that for my job, like one of the things that really like burned me out with my work was the fact that like they aren't neatly divided. Like, yeah, I do like care work and emotional labor as a therapist, right? Like helping to metabolize. This is like how I think about it now. It's like part of your work is to help metabolize like therapeutically the kind of like really horrible, traumatic, violent shit that people have experienced from like these historical systems of oppression and exploitation, right? That's like part of my job because I work in the particular field that I do. You know, but there's a lot of the like really bullshit like work that is meaningless and pointless that is also part of my job. Like the fucking endless stupid meetings that it's like, I could be doing a million other things right now. Why am I in this meeting? You know, or like the sort of things about like paperwork and like requirements of like state and federal grants, you know, all this stuff. It's like, this is completely pointless work. There's no reason to do this, especially right now. And so for me, it's kind of this like weird thing of where, I can do therapy with someone for an hour and feel tired, but very fulfilled in some way, or like feel like that was like meaningful what I just did. And at the same time, I can go from that to then doing this like stupid, pointless bullshit work for an hour or 2 hours, and then just be like, that was ridiculous. There was no reason I needed to do that. Why did I have to do that outside of just fulfilling some task that like the big other, demands that I fulfill, right?
Yeah, I like that a lot. So there was mention too in the Zizek book, the German phrase "Arbeit macht frei," which I wasn't as familiar with, but then I saw someone post, and I don't know if this was made up or not, but there was like a post on Twitter where someone at one of the protests had that on a sign. And again, I don't know if that was legit or not, but I was like, oh, okay. So then I like looked it up because originally I wasn't familiar with that term, so I thought that was interesting.
It's so weird, right? It's like how you can't even identify what's ironic or not anymore in like the ideological conditions, because it's like that is either it's like if that's either sincere or that is just such next level trolling that I like can't even conceptualize how someone could operate at that level of galactic brain irony.
It's almost too ironic to be it's too ironic for them. It has to be sincere. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's like new sincerity. It's like it's where they actually know that was like imprinted on like, the entrance to the concentration camps, and yet they are still valorizing and glorifying work in a sincere way while also being cynical and ironic with it. I mean, that's maybe where we're at. We're at like new sincerity reactionaryism. I don't know. It's
like it's curling back up against itself. It's like one of those a cow or a bull or something that has a horn or I think there's even a species of like pig or hog or boar or something where their tusk will eventually like pierce their skull and kill them. It's very, very reminiscent.
I feel like that is now my image for the people who do these like open carry protests during coronavirus, is just that image. That is perfect, actually.
I mean, that's crazy. Like that's another insane example of ideology and just like grasping onto this very hollow kind of signifier, which I think really is describing the relationship here. Is like they don't really grapple with the context of this, but it's like a signifier that they can kind of latch onto and without really understanding any of the context, which is crazy.
So have you ever read Ernest Laclau and Chantal Mouffe?
I have not.
You ever heard of them?
I have heard of Laclau.
They wrote a book. Yeah, so I think the book that they were really well known for is called I'm going to forget about it, or I'm going to forget the name. It's something like hegemony and like socialist strategy. Anyway, it's like a book of essays, but one of their ideas, what actually I find really interesting to think about how ideology functions in these particular moments, is their idea was that in any sort of like political social field or like context, right? Like a country or like a particular historical period, there are certain signifiers that they called floating signifiers, and that there are these ideas that sort of get filled up with different definitions depending on the political struggles of antagonistic groups against each other to like basically define what these words mean. So for example, freedom is a really important one of these in the history of the United States, right? The idea that like what freedom means is sort of kind of determined hegemonically, which means that it isn't like the only way to define it, but it's sort of the dominant definition, is actually the result of like material struggles of power and class society and like race and gender and all this stuff like historically. So what's really interesting to think about how ideology functions in these moments is that, those people who were at the Capitol who have this sign that says like, work will set you free or whatever the fuck it was, like what does freedom mean there? And the question is like, well, who defines what freedom means in that context, right? And I think the idea that ideology is something that like represents, where it's sort of like a symbolic or like a symbolic representation of like actual material power struggles, to me has always been a really helpful idea. So like if I talk to, like people that like family members from back home who might like support Trump or like whatever, like be more right wing, and you were to ask them like, oh, well, like what do you care about? or like what's most important to you in like politics, and they'll tell you something about like freedom or whatever. Like, like I think it is an interesting thing to explore of like, well, who defined what freedom means for them in this way? And a lot of the time it's like, well, your conception of what freedom is seems to actually be very beneficial if you're, like Warren Buffett or a Koch brother. Doesn't really seem that this definition of freedom really benefits you in a lot of way. Again, but isn't necessarily to say that if people just like, you could rationally talk someone into supporting like a different political position. Because a lot of times there's like a lot of this unconscious enjoyment, right? But I do think like what those words mean and like what signifiers mean in this like sort of floating way of like how they get sort of filled up by different groups at different times. And that's like a place of ideological struggle, I think, is actually really crucial in times like this.
It's funny. This kind of reminds me of a conversation I had with my dad. I was like, I was telling him, to me, I think this is really funny, but I told him that I thought waving the flag and like standing up for the Pledge of Allegiance and all that associated shit was un-American.
Mm-hmm. So I guess this part in the book where Zizek talks about like real nationalism is hating your own country probably hit home pretty hard.
Right. Well, I don't think he quite got it, but I got immense enjoyment out of like, which I kind of like in my own weird ideology is kind of like, that's the quote unquote, like that's the American ideal that I understood to some degree, was like being a fucking follower and a sheep, to be really obnoxious about it, is un-American,
mm-hmm.
right? Like to do what
mm-hmm.
those people are doing is un-American in the sense of what, like, in the kind of like liberal idea that I've kind of identified with or thought, kind of growing up and going, K through 12, for example, was not one to be like, like, oh, you're just going to follow like the demand to work and like this. I don't know. It's contradictory to what my conception of this idea of like liberty and freedom were from the get-go, which I think is like an interesting and funny, like it's hilarious, I think. But I think you can see the truth of it, of the idea that, yeah, like standing up for the national anthem is anti-American, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because then it comes down to like having to have some idea of how you think ideology works, because there's like one view of ideology that like ideology obscures what is reality from you. It's sort of like a false picture of what the world is or what reality is. But in Zizek's idea, in some ways it'd be interesting to look at it through this lens, because Zizek's idea of ideology is that it is precisely like what you're doing, but you do it anyway. So his example is always like the Catholic who goes to mass, who doesn't believe in anything about like transubstantiation or like taking the Eucharist, but yet like goes and does it anyway as like this ritualized gesture. Yeah. And for Zizek, it's like that's what ideology is now. Like ideology is precisely whenever you have this like distance or cynical distance towards what you're doing, and yet like you still continue to do it and it still continues to function. It like doesn't require your belief in it to function
like
anymore.
Us going to work.
And so it's an interesting
as communists or whatever,
right?
Or participating.
Yeah. And it's like, it doesn't demand your ideological complicity with like the structures of capital to keep it going, but I also think about how a lot of times, like you see this stuff with like guys on the like right-wing guys who are like so like intense and like next level about how patriotic they are. Like they, like in some ways, the guys who go to the Capitol and open carry are like, you got to wonder how much like they also have a cynical distance towards what they're doing. Like how much they on some level
wonder.
Like are like, yeah, this is like really, like it's really hyperbolic and really elaborate to like dress up like as if you're like a member of like SEAL Team 6 to like go stand around at the Capitol. It's like, it might be completely genuine. I mean, I don't know. But I could absolutely see that you could still like kind of do that almost like in a sort of like self-mocking kind of way and still yet like be very aligned with that ideology. It's almost like you sort of have the cynical distance, yet you're continuing to do it. And I think you do see some element of that because of like how like sort of like tongue-in-cheek it is sometimes, whenever you see like how like it gets represented in like memes or videos or whatever it is of like right-wing reactionaries.
I have a comment, but I probably shouldn't say it on the podcast because whatever. After the podcast, I'll mention it about what I think would. There's an image that I think is really fucking funny in the context of these people, but yeah, we'll say.
All right, that'll be for like the patrons only
right,
cut
for sure. But moving back, I think to the book, I think one of the most interesting aspects here is Zizek talking about this ideological virus, and that may even be kind of where you're already leaning. But I didn't quite grasp what he meant with this. Can you give me some context on what he was going for this global collective society as an ideological virus infecting us?
Yes, so it's a good
or
question.
That we desire
I found
to
this to be yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I'm not sure I have a good answer for this because I think this point I was a little bit like, you could definitely tell this is a hot take. Like this is not the most well thought out conceptualization that I can imagine. But I mean, I guess I read Zizek as saying that in some way, the same way that like there is like a biological event of like a virus that can infect us and that it's kind of a result of like material conditions and it changes how we see and think about the world. So I think that like what Zizek is trying to offer, and again, I don't necessarily think he's very successful with it, but I think he's trying to say that, you know, the same way that this virus will change how we see the world and it potentially will change, you know, basic coordinates of our day-to-day life, that, and this is a dialectical move, is that every time like risk and crisis becomes more acute, the possibility of like a sort of like a corresponding response to it is also possible. And I wonder if he's trying to just sort of conceptualize how we all, especially people on the left, I think, want some sort of, you know, like vision or some sort of like global unified collective kind of society, like whatever that is, right? Whether that's a state or no state or however you want to think about it. But I see him like pushing this sort of metaphor kind of and flipping it to say that, you know, right now we're all so disillusioned and so like cynical about the possibility of something like this being possible, that it's precisely in a crisis of global proportion that we then have sort of a material context in which to think about a corresponding response that would also be global. And I think, you know, again, I don't like the picture of ideology that he's offering here because it makes it sound like ideology is only just these ideas in your head. It's almost like Richard Dawkins like meme shit, where it's like, oh, like memes are just these ideas that like survive over time, and like humanity is really just like in control, like being controlled by our ideas, right?
But the material force of ideology, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
Quoting
so
Zizek.
like I think in some ways, yeah, like so I think he's like flirting with this like different conceptualization of ideology, but I think he's doing it rhetorically to say that, you know, in some way, like this change in material conditions will potentially have the opportunity for us to reconceptualize like a global collective society in a way that we can't before this, precisely because of like the fractured nature of global capitalism and the way that like regionalism as a response to a universal situation of capital is like, I think for Zizek is typically like how like our what we think resistance to global capital is to like double down on sort of like individualized specific identity. Right. And I think, you know, this is kind of what he's saying is like, we need to not return to that, because that's also the fascist move in response to global capital, right? Is to like become more entrenched in your sort of like regional identity against some sort of larger universal global project of capital. So I think like for Zizek and people like Zizek, the move is to say like, we can't like reinvest or like redouble down on those regional specific identities, like the particular and not the universal, but to say like we need to reconceptualize the universal in a new way that is not defined by capital. And that's why I think people like Zizek and Badiou are very much pushing a way to reconceptualize like a universal politics. And then that's like a whole separate debate in itself of like how they're doing that and whether that's like a valid approach or not.
Right. And I think certainly,
I don't know. Does that make sense?
No.
Is that a bunch of fucking nonsense?
I think you totally laid that out pretty well, and definitely answered my question, put it into a lot better context. Because I was like, I didn't quite see the connection he was making. But yeah, I think you're right. We could like go off, especially because I'm like on the Deleuze end of that, like of this kind of Hegel Deleuze friction.
Yeah.
But I'm curious too, like how does this operate? So I'm not sure if I understood. So he's got this quote from Viktor Orban, which I thought was.
Oh yeah, I wanted to talk about that too. Do you remember what page that's on? I wanted to pull that up.
It's on page 45. I've got the quote. I'll go ahead and read it while you're getting that up.
Yeah, go for it.
So in a recent speech, Viktor Orban said, "There is no such thing as a liberal. A liberal is nothing more than a communist with a diploma." But
sorry, that quote makes me laugh.
What the fuck? What is he even talking about? Like, I can imagine, especially it's weird given that where's Orban? Is that Hungary, or is that okay?
Yeah, he's Hungarian. Yeah,
like I could see an American politician making this statement, but for a country like Hungary that has ties to the Eastern Bloc, etc., like, what the fuck does that mean? That seems like a weird ideological phrase, and I'm like struggling to understand like what context he's even trying to get at with that idea.
Yeah, so I think that people like Viktor Orban are considered sort of at the like spear tip of this resurgent like fascism, like right-wing, like authoritarian populism in Western Europe, or like Western and Eastern Europe. So like I think part of like Orban's statement is sort of the same kind of ideological like viral infection that we see in a lot of like right-wing anti-communist ideas and anti-anarchist ideas too, because for people on the right, like everything left of like center or shit, like maybe everything left of them is all the same shit. Yeah. Like, so being a liberal for them is essentially like really no different than communism. I mean, this is exactly why people like Shapiro, like Ben Shapiro and like Jordan B. Peterson, they interpret like fairly banal liberal sorts of ideas as being like full-blown like Stalinist communist ideology. And it's because there's this like collapsing of like ideological distinctions into just one sort of weird undifferentiated mass of ideas. And so I think that Orban's quote is kind of exactly this same sort of mindset, is to, it's sort of like, it's like reactionary guerrilla mindset. It's like basically that essentially anyone who proclaims to be a liberal, like really underneath their sort of surface, they're wanting like the exact same sort of like, weird, like fucked up, skewed idea of what like a lot of right-wing reactionaries like think communism is. Like, it's basically just like a very sort of almost like deceptive mask that communists wear just to like appeal to people. But really underneath, it's like they want like the killing fields in like Cambodia or whatever they think. So that's what I kind of read him saying, is like this quote by Orban is like a really symptomatic sort of statement of this particular like right-wing, like, like kind of like crypto-fascist sort of worldview. And I think like he's also doing this precisely to set up his then like flipping this on its head, which is to say that like, what if like what does he say? Yeah, like, let me find the quote here really fast.
It's on top of the next page, I think. Or wait, no, it's on 55 maybe. I can read it if you want. Go for it. It's the part where he flips it around. If we designate as liberals those who care for our freedoms, and communists those who are aware that we can save those freedoms only with radical changes, since global capitalism is approaching a crisis, then we should say that today those of us who still recognize ourselves as communists are liberals with a diploma, liberals who seriously studied why our liberal values are under threat and became aware that only a radical change can save them. I think actually that's really fucking funny, because that's kind of what I was sort of getting at with my idea that, like, standing up for the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem or the flag or whatever, like that shit is un-American. That's kind of this, I think that same nugget, right? Because I was talking about, I guess that exact sort of idea that, these like quote unquote liberal values are antithetical to this project that neoliberalism has become.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely on the exact same point. And this is something that, I've actually talked about this with a comrade who's been on our show a couple of times, Jason Brownlee, who's a political science professor. And we've talked a lot about how, in a lot of ways, like the thing that like a lot of liberal ideology presents as sort of what it wants. Like we want, equal rights. We want to address inequality. We want, like democratic participation. We want an informed citizenry. Like what is never really grappled with is that it is precisely those ideas within a capitalist economic context and the way that those two sort of like dialectically kind of relate to each other. It is precisely in a capitalist context that those ideas are actually deeply, deeply limited and impossible to obtain. And so it is only with like a radical perspective that one, if you really care about those things, it is precisely a radical kind of revolutionary perspective that will give you actually the best chance at being able to make those things manifest. And I mean, there are some interpretations of Marx's political framework as actually being this, that really in some ways, like Marx's whole critique of capitalism is in fact to say that liberal ideology is impossible within a system of capitalism. Because at the end of the day, he said that whenever power is divided so unequally in society, this is one of my favorite Marx quotes of all time. He said, whenever right meets right, like equal rights come to face each other, force decides who wins. And I think that quote is something that liberal ideology has it causes it to sort of short circuit and break down, because it's the one thing that it can't really grapple with, is that these sort of ideals, like if you're in a context of a system that creates massive violent disparity of power and wealth and resources, then these ideas don't mean shit. Like, because at the end of the day, they're just a veneer over who has power. And I think that is exactly kind of what you're saying, is that, you can like stand up and say the national anthem and salute the flag all fucking day if you want. But if you really cared about those ideas, like why are you not like out in the streets right now, and not with the protesters, the open carry protesters at the Capitol, but like part of some like actual like radical revolutionary sort of movement that wants to actually implement these ideas truthfully. Because in a system of capitalism, the way that it structures society, it's not possible. And actually it just like helps capitalism thrive even stronger to imagine that we're actually implementing these values and these ideals in any sort of way.
Yeah, liberalism can't even accommodate the promise of what it tries to advocate for.
Yeah, and I mean, this is maybe a little controversial to say, but in some ways, it's like, I feel like I still to this day get along much better with like people like my family back home who were like reactionaries, like versus like my liberal friends in social work, because it's like, well, at least I feel like the reactionaries like have a certain like sort of like, there's no like covering of what they really want. It's like, at least, it's pretty on the surface, like what they think and like what they think their project is. And it's like, I can respect that. It's what Malcolm X said. It's like, at least I know, with the Southern racist, like I'm going to see the knife in his hand, like before he stabs me. Like, at least there's an honesty to it. And I think to some degree, I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I can kind of understand that.
One topic that I think we'll probably wrap up on, we have a lot of notes, but I think this is probably, to me, the most interesting aspect of this is the logic of panic. And I think... I think this is...
Yeah. I was hoping we would get to talk about this.
This is really fascinating because, in the context of something like the toilet paper shortage, I think that like, in the context of the logic of scarcity and of capitalism as it exists, it is rational to panic, right? Like I think that's the kind of irony, or maybe the dialectical like reversal of this is like, I was kind of thinking about that, and this is a hot take too, to be honest, is like, yes, it's logical to hoard or to panic about those kinds of things under the structures of capitalism, because it's like, oh, there may not be enough. I have to consume this amount, right? Like that makes sense. What's really funny to me, and I don't know if you remember this, but it was a couple of years ago where we had a quote unquote gas shortage. Do you recall this? It was like maybe 2 summers ago.
I recall this very well, and let me just say that me and one of our sort of like structural components of Red Library, Comrade Commissar Don, as he goes by, we were actually talking about this multiple times of how, it's so funny that wasn't that long ago. And already once this happened and like the toilet paper crisis happened, the first thing I thought about is like, does no one remembering the gas crisis from a few years ago? Because this is like the logic of this is exactly the same. So yes, I remember that very well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But exactly this same thing. And I think too, like, to get Baudrillardian, this weird, like, simulated world that we live in creates, like, the panic is an idea, and then it does, like, it's almost, well, ideology too. It's like the material force of ideology creates the actual actions that are taking place.
Yeah.
Which I think is pretty funny. And like, it's weird.
Yeah.
I think now, I don't know, maybe I'm just more aware of these sort of things. I don't recall there ever being a situation in my earlier life where I observed this sort of shit happening in the wild. But now that I'm adult, it's very clear, like, this weird relationship between perception and reality, and like technology playing a part in that sort of logic of panic itself.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of dialectical relation between material conditions and the ideology that sort of relates to them, I think, is important because, in some sense, what you're seeing is how there is this logic of scarcity because we exist in material conditions of scarcity. Like, that's kind of what everyone operates on, is this idea that, I think, two things. One, there are only a very, very limited amount of things, and I basically have to compete with everyone else to make sure that I maximize my like consumption or like obtaining of those resources. But there's another piece of this that's really important, which is that I can't rely on anyone else to help like provide some sort of like collective solidarity with me in this moment. So I better make sure that I hoard as much of that as possible.
Exactly.
So I think that like those are like material conditions of capitalism that create that sort of like basic phenomenological experience of the world. Then something like the pandemic happens, and then all of a sudden like that idea like gains immense power, and then we operate on it, and then the sort of the idea that emerged out of like, or sort of in relationship to a material condition, then becomes accelerated, becomes more intense, and then that in turn feeds back into the material conditions and then exacerbates those into conditions of scarcity even more. And you have this sort of like really horrible diabolical feedback loop. But, it's like, where do you sort of like pick out, like, where does that begin and where does it end? It's like, it's a total process that's happening. But, there's one thing I wanted to read too, really quick, if you don't mind, in this, because this is one of my favorite quotes in the whole thing. What Zizek says, this on page 64, he says, "What this contrast tells us is that panic is not a proper way to confront a real threat. When we react in panic, we do not take the threat seriously. We, on the contrary, trivialize it. Just think how ridiculous is the notion that having enough toilet paper would matter in the midst of a deadly epidemic." And so what I really love about this is that, this is sort of Zizek's kind of whole approach that I think, hot take or not, it can really, I think, like shift your way of thinking, especially if you've never read shit like this before, is to say that, oh yeah, like even though this looks like you're taking something incredibly seriously, what you're actually doing, this trivializing, is you're not actually thinking about the larger like structural conditions that like would actually be, you'd have to change those if you really want to address the situation. And so, like going and buying a shit ton of toilet paper in a weird way is it's a weird way that we're like trivializing and sort of disconnecting ourselves from the larger structural situation that's actually happening. And I think that's what we do all the time. That's like in a way what gets us out of this sort of feeling of being implicated in capitalism itself, is this idea that, well, whenever shit hits the fan, as long as I'll just go buy enough toilet paper and make sure I'm taking care of for me, without realizing that it's like you are part of the problem. It's like structurally, like you and the problem are the same thing. And I think that's a really hard shift to make, especially whenever, you're socialized to be this like individual consumer, and we're all socialized to be that, whether we like it or
like
not.
Whenever you're just this atomized subject that has no connection to any larger social context other than like through the avenue of consumption. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think it's interesting too in the context of markets and how markets function, because I don't think that, I mean, obviously, like, depending on whom you're speaking to, but I think it's a little bit counterintuitive or goes against common sense that markets enforce scarcity. Like, I don't think that the average person recognizes that relationship, that, like, markets are distributing goods based on, like, who has the most resources, right?
Yeah.
Or etc. Or they're driving that kind of consumption that causes the very thing that you're trying to avoid. You know what I mean? That kind of market mechanism.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, this comes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like, the function of ideology in all of this, right? Because you have to ask yourself the question. It's like what, like, how does that happen? That markets are understood as doing the exact opposite of what they actually do. And that's the really important question to ask is to try to think through how is it possible that functions so well. This is like kind of the basic like sociological kind of method, right? Is to make the familiar strange. I mean, I think that's what a lot of like critique of ideology and like sort of this like cultural criticism is really about, is to say like, what if we take these things that we just take for granted and make them strange and try to like understand them and like look at them as if it was like the first time we ever saw them. And this is exactly one of them. Like, markets equal freedom, equal, individual liberty, equal like prosperity for everyone to the maximum degree. I mean, that's like this sort of like, signifying chain that we all sort of like exist in all the time. And like, that's what's like so hard, is because, to critique like capitalism, right? Like is like, if I was to talk to, let's say like a family member from back home or someone I went to high school with who, very patriotic, very nationalistic, really thinks capitalism is the best of all possible systems. If you were to ask them like, well, okay, well, why do you think this is the best? More often than not, it's going to come down to a question about freedom and prosperity, right? That like, this is the thing that's going to help bring the most prosperity to everybody. And so there's this like signifying chain that you sort of have to like really systematically deconstruct, I think, to eventually break that sort of ideological kind of hold that it has on people, because they're, it isn't just like markets, right? It's about the most basic fundamental value in like the history of the United States, like political and ideological sort of development, which is like freedom and liberty, right? And so it's like, if your basic fundamental economic system is connected to the idea that this is going to maximize those, that's a really deeply embedded thing that you're trying to sort of critique and I think it's not unfair to say break, because I guess to go back to what you were saying earlier, and to some way, like, maybe for you, like thinking about your political perspective, I imagine to some degree it's also about, well, this is actually like the most effective way to actualize these sorts of things that are going to be most beneficial to people. I mean, shit, I know that's why I have the political view I do. It's like, I legitimately think this is the best way to get to this point, And so it's just like kind of it makes sense to me why it's so hard to talk about this stuff with people who like think very differently than you, because, it's like you're fundamentally having to deconstruct like everything about you think about the world just to like talk about one
just
thing,
to like just to nudge the door open.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think too, alongside that, like this critique of markets in particular, it's like, or this frequent argument or refrain you hear is that, capitalism has been brought about, generated the most wealth in history, or, this idea of prosperity and how it's brought more prosperity than ever before. But we ask the question like, prosperity or whatever for whom, like, you know what I mean? Yes, absolutely. Capitalism has, made capitalists more wealthy than any other system in the history of the world. Yes, absolutely. Capitalism has brought prosperity to like those at the 1% that own everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
More than ever before. But what has it done for like the lowest among us? And I think I forget who the quote is from, but isn't it like judging a society based on how they treat the lowest among them is the real like rubric you should sort of strive for.
Yeah. It's funny. Did you ever watch Eddie Murphy? Like Eddie Murphy's like stand-up specials?
Like Raw and Delirious and all that?
So, yeah. I can't remember which one it was, but there's the whole joke about like the wife who says like, what have you done for me lately? Do you remember this joke?
I off the top of my head, I don't.
But I was just thinking about this because there was a recent episode we did on McGowan's Capitalism and Desire, and Alex, who was on our show, coined one of my favorite phrases of all time now, which is capitalism is my future ex-wife. But I was thinking about this because it's like, yeah, that's the question that we should be all asking capitalism, is that, like, unless you're like Elon Musk, the real question is like, capitalism, what have you done for me lately? You haven't done shit. So like, why are we continuing in this relationship?
Exactly. Yeah, it's like survivorship. What is it? Survivorship? No, not survivorship bias, but like sunk cost fallacy. That's where we're at with capitalism. It's like we've sunk we've been together so these couple of last centuries. Hey, they've been great. Okay, we have all these things. Lifespans are going up, etc. But maybe it's time to move on for us both now.
Yeah, that's what I think, right? Like, if this was a healthy relationship and not a toxic relationship, totally. And I think this is the true dialectical Marxist perspective, is to be like, yeah, things were good for a while, maybe for a little bit, but then they became toxic and we both grown as people and we just need to go our separate ways because, you've done some great things. I couldn't have gotten here without you, but really, our relationship has run its course. And we're going to end that relationship by violently revolutionary overthrowing of the system. But, in some ways, I think it's like that's always the dialectical, like, Marxist idea, is to be like, yeah, like, capitalism created certain conditions in, like, a certain, like, sort of shift in history that then will set conditions for something else that could, in a way, potentially, take all that ability to create the greatest surplus in the history of, humanity in terms of, like, politics and economics, and to actually be able to distribute that surplus in a way that will not just horribly, impoverish like 99.9% of all of humanity for the sake of that like fraction of a percent, So, I think that's the idea. It's like we just got to, understand that it's a toxic relationship, and we have to like maybe go like, this is where psychoanalysis comes in. We got to go talk to our therapist. We got to go get some psychoanalysis done. And then maybe realize, the nature of the relationship that we're in. So then maybe we'll de-invest from it.
And then, just like in Titanic, we just let capitalism is Jack. We're just going to like let it sink. You know what I mean?
And you know what I really love about that idea too? Because there's always that criticism, like there was plenty of room on the door for Jack and Rose, but she still let him just sink into the abyss and drown. And so I think this is exactly right. It's like there might be enough room on the door for us and capitalism, but we're not gonna fall prey to that. We're gonna let capitalism sink into the abyss.
We will grow old in our warm beds in our communist utopia. Right?
That's the idea. Or anarcho-communist utopia. I really don't care what we call it. So as long as it's not capitalism.
I don't want to see no commodity production ever again. No money, no exchange of paper notes ever. What else? So we're abolishing money, we're abolishing private property, commodity production.
From each according to the ability. Oh no, shit! What is it? From each according to the ability to each according to the need.
That's what Bernard Sanders stands for.
That's the revolutionary program. It's just straight Marxism 101. So.
Was there? We skipped some of the notes we had, but I felt like, we pretty much hit the highlights. Was there anything else though that you were like burning to discuss, or something that you wanted to add at all before we wrap up?
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll just tag on, and this is again just a nice little dialectical idea. Zizek has this sort of comment about like the specters are more terrifying the more invisible they are, and sort of this difference between reality and the real. And I realize I should probably pull up a quote because I shouldn't try to wing this considering how complicated of an idea it was. Hold on one second.
Real reality is real. Real recognize real.
Is that how that works? Real knows when it sees itself on the road?
The real is like seeking recognition of the other in itself. I don't know. I'm just freestyling kind of real shit. What we're dealing with here is the distinction elaborated by Lacan between reality and the real. Reality is external reality, our social and material space to which we are used and within which we are able to orient ourselves and interact with others, while the real is a spectral entity, invisible and for the that very reason appearing as all-powerful. The moment that this spectral agent becomes part of our reality, its power is localized. It becomes something we can deal with. And then even if we lose the battle, as long as this transposition into reality cannot take place, we get trapped in either an anxious paranoia, pure globality, or resort to ineffective symbolizations through acting outs that expose us to unnecessary risks, and that would be pure locality. And I think that was the dialectical contradiction that you were maybe getting towards. Earlier, really, you kind of talked about how retreating to pure locality was the risk, as opposed to trying to work towards a new globality or new universal.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's kind of what I would leave off on too, is that, sort of trying not to fall prey to like the double blackmail, as Zizek would call it, this sort of like this anxious paranoia of like pure globality, or like sort of again like this collapse into like just the local regionalized responses. So I guess what I really like about Zizek's approach, even if again it's a hot take, a very long hot take, is just that he always constantly emphasizes this ability to not fall prey into like one side of this dichotomy that's presented to us. And I think that in some ways, the political project that Zizek is operating in sort of in the service of, or like what he's aiming at, is to theorize to some degree like what it would look like to conceptualize or to sort of develop a new universal like global kind of political vision. And his particular perspective is one that sees this crisis of the pandemic as giving us like potentially an opening into that. But it's a perilous one, because we can also fall prey into this sort of like anxious paranoia, or this sort of like collapse into this regionalism. And so, in a way, like part of what we're trying to do is to take the real, the spectral entity of the real, and to make it graspable in reality, to then be able to deal with it and to conceptualize like possibilities in a new way. And, again, it's especially important to step back and to do that in the midst of a crisis, like to not fall prey to the logic of panic and to trivialize what we're actually encountering. Because, Zizek's thing he talks about, and I think this is a really apt situation to think about it, is where he says, like, don't just do something, think. That in this sort of moment, the tendency is going to be to just react and to engage in some act, to just say, I have to be doing something. And I think his point is that as long as we stay stuck in that, we, in a sense, are just feeding back into the system of global capital, continuing to function and to sort of prey upon crisis and our sort of vulnerability to it even more effectively. And so the role of theory, the role of, the sort of the philosopher in this, is to actually give us that ability to pause and step back and really think about what's going on. Because until we do that, we're not going to be able to see, a potential crack in the structure that could then provide an escape. And I think that's, as important now as ever. So, I mean, ending with this distinction between reality and real, I think is actually was one of the strongest parts of the book, because to me, it was one of the clearest theorizations of like Zizek's perspective and what it has to bring in this particular pandemic, I think.
I don't really have anything to add. I think that's a fantastic way to close out the episode. So now I will give you the opportunity to plug the things. Now you have 5 minutes to plug all of your things.
I don't even know if I have 5 minutes of things to plug. Well, the big one, I'm gonna plug shit that just I'm not even a part of. I'm gonna do a Zizek thing where I'm gonna take all 5 minutes. Yeah, and then I'm gonna take another 5 minutes. The big thing is, obviously I'm one of, not the only, but definitely one of the hosts of Red Library Political Education podcast for Today's Left. So for any of y'all peoples out there who haven't listened to us yet, the basic premise is that we take every episode, or every group of episodes is basically where we sort of take a book of theory or political thought or history, and we actually try to teach that book to each other on the show, or to like talk through a book and discuss it in a way that makes it accessible and relevant for people, engaged in leftist politics in any sort of way, whether that's like you're just studying and learning on your own, or you're actually part of an organization or whatever it might be. But the idea is like it is designed to be an educational podcast that's very hopefully accessible and, you know, fun and yet still relevant, and like doesn't sacrifice complexity for also, you know, just having a good time and enjoying like the sort of the pleasure of like reading and studying and learning.
The
and stuff.
jouissance.
So that's kind of, yeah, like pure jouissance. I mean, that's really what the show is about. And we try to make it as perverse as possible. So we do a lot of stuff related to like Marxism, but we've also read some like anarchist thought, some anarcho-communist thought, but we do a lot of stuff on like the history of political movements and labor. Right now we're going through a big psychoanalysis phase. We're reading a lot of stuff related to Lacan and like modern Lacanian theorists. So that's the thing. So, I mean, you know, I know there's a lot of overlap between the stuff that you do and some of the stuff that we do. So hopefully people can come check us out, and we're going to keep plugging your show as well. Our podcast is now part of what's called the Lost Horizons Podcast Network, which is us, The Regrettable Century, and From 78. And we sort of kind of all consider ourselves unified by exploring the idea of dialectical pessimism, which is kind of like a very Zizek Lacanian sort of inspired way to think about politics and leftist radical politics now in this context. So we now do a sort of like collaborative show a couple of times a month where all the different people from the podcast get together and just sort of like talk about different current events or different theoretical ideas. So that's something that there's a feed out there so people can check that out, and I can send you some links if you'd like. I guess the last thing is I have a blog that I don't do very often, but every once in a while I'll get inspired and I'll write like usually a very, very long, really dense theoretical piece. It's called Capillaries Theory at the Front. And so I have a couple of pieces on there that people might want to check out. It's just sort of related to a lot of the stuff that comes out on Red Library in my theoretical perspective. So yeah, those are the big things. Yeah, I think that's about it, honestly.
So just for my listeners, I think that there's a definitely like Adam said, there's a tremendous amount of overlap in interest, and I think we cover a fairly amount of common ground, definitely when it comes to, I think, Lacan in particular. But I mean, I feel like I can't remember if maybe it was just Regrettable Century or not that did something on like Yugoslavia, the economy of Yugoslavia. That was fucking fascinating. Thought that was really, that's something that I'm like super fascinated by, is like, okay, what about Albania and like Yugoslavia, and like how did those economies function, you know, outside of the, you know, USSR, but still under communism or like some type of a socialist economy. And just like so many interesting characters too, like Hoxha and some other guys that are involved. And wait, who was the, okay, so Hoxha was he the Albanian? Or was, okay.
Yeah. It was all about them bunkers.
So he was the one that was like calling fucking Castro and like and Che like anarchists and like revisionists and shit, which I think is fucking hilarious, like given the context.
Yeah, just total Chad. Yeah, just total Chad.
Really funny stuff. But yeah, I think anybody that likes my podcast would definitely be someone that could get something out of Red Library, absolutely. So just want to share that feedback there. But let's see. What about like social media feeds? You didn't mention any of that before I go on my own.
Oh yeah.
Patreon, all that good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, so we have a Patreon, so we're trying to work up to 50 patrons right now, and so that's an ongoing project. We have a Twitter account. I sort of am not a wizard of shit posting, but I sort of combine shit posting with like legit theoretical musings or like quotes from the things that we're reading and studying. So people can follow us on Twitter. You know, we have a Facebook, we have a MySpace, we have an AOL Messenger account if people want to find us on there. Oh snap. But yeah, so I would say like, yeah, if people like what y'all do, I think especially for the Lacanian psychoanalytic stuff, again, we do a lot of that. We just did a big two-parter on Alenka Zupancic's What is Sex? We're doing a Todd McGowan reading series right now. We've had Neil on like in multiple capacities. He's doing the McGowan reading series with us. So if they liked your episode with Neil from 78, they can come check us out reading through Capitalism and Desire with Neil, which is a hell of a lot of fun. Our skin episode actually drops on the 3rd. And so we're going to be doing that reading series probably for like 8 or 9 episodes. So yeah, lots of good stuff. And
yeah, we should also mention too that I will be joining you for a discussion on Baudrillard's symbolic
That's right.
exchange and death. coming up soon.
It's gonna be lit.
So I've really enjoyed that, especially after I've been reading Felix Guattari's Machinic Unconscious, and going to symbolic exchange and death is it's kind of like when you you put that old trick where you push your arm against the wall for 30 seconds and then it lifts on its own. That was kind of the feeling I got after for making that switch. It was oh shit, this is way easier to understand, and it's covering a lot of the same a decent amount of the same ground. So definitely looking forward to that conversation as well.
Yeah, that's going to be a really good one. And I think we're also going to do a Deleuze episode at some point soon with maybe another guest. But yeah, I mean, I think it's important that people, especially who might be kind of newer to Marxist or anarchist ideas, also get exposed to that stuff, because that stuff is really important to read, especially, if you're around on today's left and not the left of 100 years ago. It's people have written other shit since Lenin. So it's important to read the other stuff too. So we try to be really broad and expansive in the kind of stuff that we read. And so, yeah, I think Baudrillard is going to be awesome to cover, and it should be I'm sure there will be a lot of perverse jouissance whenever we do that episode.
I'm looking forward to it. I think it's cool because he's kind of taking Marxism. He's taking Marxist political economy, semiotics, and psychoanalysis and jamming those three together. And I like that. I really like that. I don't know. There's something really fascinating, the political economy of the sign, etc., which I won't go too much further into. But thanks again for joining me on the show, Adam. I'm gonna close this out by reminding folks about my Patreon again at patreon.com/MUHH, the podcast Twitter account at UnconsciousHH, and the Instagram account at UnconsciousHH as well. But this will be the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry, signing out for the week.
The very rules of evil,
Cheers.
of negativity and singularity.
Peace out, y'all.
Stop this recording. Stop this recording.
Including the ultimate form of singularity, which is podcast. Violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. So on and so on. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.